Religious freedom. Survivors and leaders in the fight against Christian persecution discuss the situation in Iran. Playing God.
This is really a horrifying thought.
A researcher claims he's made the first genetically edited babies. Fetal tissue. Pro-lifers turn up the pressure on the Trump administration to stop funding research using aborted babies. And touchdown celebration. We'll tell you why scientists from NASA have reason to smile. On EWTN News Nightly for Tuesday, November 27th, 2018. Good evening from Washington, D.C., and thank you to those of you joining us from around the world for news from a Catholic perspective. I'm Lauren Ashburn. The White House says it doesn't want children to get hurt, but migrants need to follow the law, and it defends its use of tear gas against women and children trying to cross the border from Mexico. The clash became a key topic today at the White House briefing room. White House correspondent Mark Irons was there and reports. Good evening, Mark.
Good evening, Lauren. The White House is encouraging migrants to enter the U.S. through ports of entry and says the previous administration used similar enforcement measures to protect the border.
Law enforcement officials have used appropriate non-lethal force to protect themselves and prevent an illegal rush across the border. And let's also not forget that this isn't the first time that non-lethal force like this has been used. In fact, tear gas was used on average once a month during the Obama administration.
Also during today's briefing, White House Press Secretary Sarah Sanders questioned a report on climate change released by the Trump administration. The National Climate Assessment says natural disasters are worsening in the United States because of global warming. The president says he doesn't believe the economic devastation predicted in the report. Here's what the press secretary added.
It's not based on facts. It's not data driven. We'd like to see something that is more data driven. It's based on modeling, which is extremely hard to do when you're talking about the climate. Again, our focus is on making sure we have the safest, cleanest air and water.
The more than 1,500-page report compiled by multiple federal agencies lays out the devastating effects a changing climate can have on the economy, environment, and health. And Lauren, connecting these two issues of migrants heading to the U.S. southern border and climate change, I spoke with an official who has been working with Catholic Relief Services in Central America for 20 years. He tells me the number one reason people are fleeing Honduras is due to years of drought, followed by flooding. He referred to these migrants as climate refugees. Lauren?
I haven't heard that term before. Mark, the president is heading next to South America for the G20. What are his priorities?
The White House says President Trump will hold meetings with a long list of world leaders, including Russian President Vladimir Putin. He also wants to press China's leader to agree to a trade deal. If China refuses, the White House says the U.S. will slap another $267 billion in tariffs against China. Lauren?
White House correspondent Mark Irons. Thank you, Mark. Special counsel Robert Mueller says former campaign chairman Paul Manafort violated his plea agreement by lying to the FBI. The allegation could expose him to a lengthier prison sentence and more criminal charges. Manafort denies the accusation. President Trump says Mueller is, quote, ruining lives. Today, Mississippi voters decide the last U.S. Senate race of the midterms, but history will be made no matter who wins. Republican Senator Cindy Hyde-Smith would be the first woman ever elected to Congress from the state. She describes herself as pro-life and has been endorsed by the National Right to Life. Democrat Mike Espy would be the state's first African-American U.S. senator since Reconstruction. Espy is pro-abortion. Pope Francis names Bishop Daniel Garcia to take over as Bishop of Monterey, California. The Texas native is currently an auxiliary bishop in Austin. The Diocese of Monterey is heavily influenced by Saint Junipero Serra, an 18th century priest who Pope Francis canonized when he was here in the U.S. in 2015. 3 American soldiers have been killed in Afghanistan. They died in a roadside bombing in the country's eastern Ghazni province. The blast wounded 3 other service members and an American contractor. The military has not released the names of those who were killed. No group has claimed responsibility for the attack. At least 12 soldiers have been killed so far this year in the war that began in 2001. President Trump is committed to promoting religious freedom wherever it is under threat. That's the word from a top State Department official who is shining the spotlight on one of the world's worst persecutors of Christians, Iran. Correspondent Wyatt Goolsbee has the details from the State Department. Good evening, Wyatt.
Good evening, Lauren. The U.S. Special Representative for Iran, Brian Hook, is usually working on issues related to the Iranian nuclear program and Iran's support for terrorism around the world. But today, he took some time to talk with religious liberty advocates and survivors from Iran who endured human rights violations. Hook making his remarks at an international religious freedom roundtable on Capitol Hill. He heard from faith groups, including Christians, Sufi, and Baha'i, all minority groups persecuted by Iran's regime. I spoke with a Protestant pastor, Farhad Sabokru. He and his wife and 2 church workers at the Assemblies of God went to jail for a year for converting to Christianity and preaching the gospel to his flock. His church was ransacked.
برای اینکه رژیم متوجه شده که مسیحیت در ایران به شکل خیلی شدیدی در
Pastor Farhad telling me Christianity is rapidly on the rise, even though the regime doesn't support it. Protestant and other evangelical groups have been building churches in recent years, and he believes that has led to a crackdown. At today's roundtable, officials mentioned religious minorities are seen by the government as agents of foreign countries. Hamid Garagozu is an international organization to preserve human rights.
This has been a losing battle for the regime. The more they oppress and they persecute us, the more the world, the Iranian community, the nation becomes aware. And the level and scale of it is increasing day by day. The taboo has been broken. People have realized that they can stand up to this regime. And it's a one-way street. There's no going back.
There is optimism here that religious liberty is on the horizon in Iran, but it's clear there's still a lot of problems. The Christian advocate group Open Doors USA still ranks Iran as number 10 on their list of the world's worst persecutors of Christians. Lauren?
Wyatt, I understand Secretary Mike Pompeo called out the Iranian regime. What did he say?
Lauren, Secretary Pompeo was responding to threats against the U.S. and Israel by the president of Iran, Hassan Rouhani. Pompeo says Iran is not a friend of America or Israel when they call for the deaths of millions, including Muslims. He says Iranian people do not support their government and that the people have suffered tyranny for far too long. Lauren?
Correspondent Wyatt Goolsbee reporting from the State Department. Thank you, Wyatt. Christians in Ukraine are asking for prayers as tensions with Russia escalate. On Sunday, Moscow captured 3 Ukrainian Navy vessels. In response, Kiev introduced martial law. It also called Russia's actions an act of aggression. And voters in Taiwan reject legalizing same-sex unions. They also passed a referendum asking that marriage be restricted to 1 man and 1 woman. Taiwan would have been the first country in Asia to approve same-sex weddings. The country is roughly 5% Christian. Pope Francis says the sickness of consumerism is the enemy of generosity.
Quanti paio di scarpe ho?
During Mass yesterday, the Holy Father encouraged the faithful to take a look at how many things we have. He used the example of shoes, saying, if you have too many, give some away. Vatican correspondent Juliette Lindley joins us from Rome. Juliette, in the past week, the U.S. has celebrated Black Friday and Cyber Monday, and today's Giving Tuesday. So tell us what the Pope's message is about the dangers of consumerism.
Lauren, the Holy Father, in fact, did not reference the shopping craze, but he did say we should all give a little something to the poor, even clothes, shoes, or groceries. He said that we can make miracles with generosity of little things, even when it comes to giving away possessions of which we have too many.
It's not the first time that Pope Francis has said something like this.
That's right, Lauren. Very early in his pontificate, in 2013, he released a document called The Joy of the Gospel, and in it, Pope Francis called unfettered capitalism the new tyranny. The Holy Father criticized the global economic system and the idolatry of money, as he called it, and he urged politicians to alleviate inequality and called on the rich to share their wealth. One line in the document that made headlines was a reference to homelessness, Pope Francis asked, how can it be that it's not a news item when an elderly homeless person dies, but it is news when the stock market loses 2 points? Lauren.
You know, Pope John Paul II also spoke out strongly about capitalism. What was his line of thinking?
The late Pope wrote about the dangers of unbridled capitalism in one of his encyclicals called Centesimus Annus, and he warned against unfair working conditions, long hours, and long wages. In that same document, John Paul II also reminded the faithful the Church defends the right to owning private property. The Church says that it is fundamental for the development of persons.
Juliette Lindley, EWTN News Nightly Vatican correspondent. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Lauren.
Pope Benedict XVI issues a correction after an article suggests he questioned the foundation of Jewish-Christian dialogue. In it, a German theologian accused the retired pope of minimizing the suffering Christians have inflicted on Jewish people. Benedict calls the allegations, quote, absolutely false and grotesque nonsense. Coming up, pro-lifers step up their attempts to stop fetal tissue research. Scientists and experts in bioethics are expressing shock, anger, and alarm after a Chinese researcher claims he helped make the world's first genetically edited babies. Meanwhile, in Washington, pro-life lawmakers are fighting for medical ethics in another field. Correspondent Jason Calvi is on Capitol Hill. Good evening, Jason.
Good evening, Lauren. I'm getting a first look at a draft of a letter lawmakers plan to send to the Trump administration. They're upset about a $13 million contract between the National Institutes of Health and the University of California. The research being federally funded requires bone marrow, liver, and thymuses from unborn babies.
Health and Human Services Secretary Alex Azar will soon hear from pro-life lawmakers. In a letter they write, exploiting even one unborn child in this way is repulsive and should stop, regardless of the outcomes hoped for by researchers.
The problem with using fetal cells is they are coming from aborted fetuses.
Catholic bioethicist Dr. Kevin Donovan says fetal research hasn't yielded major scientific breakthroughs.
It certainly hasn't produced any cures. And so when they say that, they're accurate. Are there treatments that have been produced using fetal cells? Yes, there have. And, you know, could they have been done with other cells instead? Yes, they could have.
And in China, another bioethics controversy erupts. A researcher claims he created the world's first genetically modified babies, editing the genetic code of twin girls to help them resist AIDS.
I know this is probably going to be the world first. So if it's not safe or have any problem, it may rule the entire field, and the people may lose the trust in the new technology.
No other scientists have confirmed his claims.
This is really a horrifying thought. It remains to be seen if it's true.
The dean of Harvard Medical School shares concerns.
It's basically a molecular scissors. We can cut DNA and make changes, but it's unclear how precise that cutting is. And so the worry is that you'd cut in places you don't want to cut, inactivating genes that are very important, or maybe changing the expression of genes that could predispose to other problems like cancer.
Here in the United States, National Institutes of Health this year estimates spending more than $100 million on fetal research, and abortion is a key way to get that tissue. Congress investigated fetal tissue donation and possible sales. They referred Planned Parenthood and other groups to the Department of Justice for potential criminal charges. Lauren?
Correspondent Jason Calvi. Thank you, Jason. Joining me now is Dr. David Prentiss, Vice President and Research Director for the Charlotte Lozier Institute, and Dr. Tara Sander-Lee, an Associate Scholar with that same institute. Welcome to the program.
Thank you.
Dr. Sander-Lee, let's start with you. You encourage the use of life-affirming alternatives to this fetal tissue research, like adult stem cells or skin cells for research. If this produces better results, why isn't the scientific community embracing it more?
I think the reason is because it's so entrenched in how they've been doing science for so long, and currently there is no law that says that they can't. And so I think that's why it's important for HHS and other authorities to actually really reconsider how mechanisms, things that they can do to actually redirect some of these funds so that this research can discontinue and we can invest in actual science that is working better and is ethical.
Let's read something by Cardinal Timothy Michael Dolan, Archbishop of New York, and then chairman of U.S. Catholic Bishops' Pro-Life Committee, said in September, quote, "Under a pro-life administration, there is simply no room for callously using aborted children to further a research goal. This must stop immediately. Our government should only use taxpayer dollars for ethical research." Dr. Prentiss, the processing, though, of these fetal baby parts, the tissue, makes a lot of money.
Unfortunately, it does. And actually, that's not supposed to happen according to federal statute. They're not supposed to be making a profit, yet we've seen evidence, as was referred to earlier, and referred to the Department of Justice, that some of these companies, as well as Planned Parenthood, are making not just tens, but hundreds and thousands of dollars off of the processing of baby brains, hearts, livers, and the trafficking of those organisms.
It's a hard topic to talk about, and my heart goes out to the two of you who do this for a living every single day. Dr. Sanderly is a scientist with almost 20 years experience in academic and clinical medicine. I have to ask you, as you're teaching the next generation of scientists, what do you say to them to balance, to get them to learn how to balance good science, but with sound ethical judgment?
I think the important thing is that just because you can do it doesn't mean that you should. And you have to carefully examine each experiment that you're doing. And we cannot exploit one group of human beings for the benefit of another. Every human being has a right to life. And we need to protect that life, not at the expense of future treatments that are going to be tainted and are going to really put people in some very tough decisions.
Speaking of tainted in the future generations, if we could, I'd like to talk, Dr. Prentiss, about the ethical dilemma, not just with fetal tissue research, but on the ethical implications of gene editing, as we saw Jason in the piece earlier say that this researcher said that gene editing allegedly did take place. And it seems to be an example of just what you said. Just because it can be done, it shouldn't be, or it doesn't mean it should be. So what does this mean? Is it going to open the floodgates to designer babies?
Well, that's certainly the worry. And you've used the right term. This is a designer baby, not just editing the embryo, but allowing that embryo, then manufacturing that embryo to be born with certain chosen traits manufactured through genetic engineering. And it's going to affect not just this individual, but their progeny as well.
The next, the grandchildren, the children.
Exactly.
It gives me shivers to think that this one man in China had the ability to take a knife to that DNA and say, nah, I'm going to play God. I don't think that should be in there. Right. Anyway, great discussion. Thank you so much, both of you, Dr. Prentiss, as well as Dr. Tara Sander Lee of the Charlotte Lozier Institute. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you very much.
First Lady Melania Trump is preparing care packages for troops deployed overseas. She says it's a small way to say thank you.
As we begin this Christmas season, which traditionally means spending time with loved ones, I believe we should also take time to remember all that we are thankful for as a nation.
She was joined by Second Lady Karen Pence. The packages contain snacks, toiletries, and playing cards. They will be sent to military stationed in Iraq, Poland, and Kuwait. Up next, two members of President Trump's cabinet tour the devastation caused by California's wildfires. And Pope Francis receives a close-up view of some of Russia's finest religious art. The California fires are contained but not forgotten. U.S. Interior Secretary Ryan Zinke and U.S. Agriculture Secretary Sonny Perdue toured the destroyed town of Paradise, California. Both are pushing for more aggressive forest management. Zinke says costs associated with the deadly Northern California wildfire could be in the billions. The U.S. government has distributed more than $20 million in assistance. Catholic University professor Will Rainford resigns as the head of the social work department after posting controversial tweets. In September, Rainford criticized women, accusing Supreme Court Justice Brett Kavanaugh of sexual assault. He will take a sabbatical during the 2019 spring semester and will return to teach classes at CUA. A private college in New Jersey blocks the restaurant Chick-fil-A as a dining option. Rider University says the fast food chain is, quote, widely perceived to be in opposition to the LGBTQ community. Chick-fil-A says it supports Christian values and its purpose is to glorify God by being faithful stewards. NASA scientists perform a touchdown celebration. I love seeing these guys. They're so excited. You think of, these guys as geeks, right? Not like that. Anyway, at least I do. Landed on Mars yesterday after a 6-month journey of nearly 100 million miles. InSight has sent back 2 photos. More are expected in the coming days. It was NASA's 8th landing on Mars since 1976. Finally tonight, Pope Francis takes in some religious art. This morning, he visited the exhibit Pilgrimage of Russian Art. It's on display near St. Peter's Square. He had a 40-minute private tour from the director of the Vatican Museums, and the exhibition features more than 50 pieces, and many of them have never left Russia. A news report, not a new report, in Moscow says the Holy Father was greatly impressed by the artwork. I would have loved to have seen that. For all of us here at EWTN News Nightly, to all of you around the world, thank you for watching. I'm Lauren Ashburn. Let's keep in touch online. Follow me at Lauren Ashburn on Twitter and Lauren Ashburn EWTN on Facebook. Good night, and God bless you.